Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's event on the launch of our most recent report, Protecting Point-to-Point Messaging Apps, Understanding Telegram, WeChat, and WhatsApp. My name's Rose Jackson, and I'm the director of the Democracy and Tech Initiative here at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Our center examines how the ways technology is funded, built, and governed impacts the long-term viability of human rights and democracy globally. Today, we're joined by an exciting panel of experts to discuss what we call point-to-point messaging apps. Think of WhatsApp, Signal, iMessage, Telegram, or even WeChat. And though the majority of the world uses these apps to communicate and do business and connect with one another, they're often excluded from conversations about information integrity and the broader social media landscape. Here in the United States, it's estimated that about 2/3 of the population makes use of these apps in some form. But there's significant misunderstandings about how they function, their levels of security and privacy, varying techniques for enforcing policies and ensuring safety, and how and why people engage with them. Apps like WhatsApp and Telegram have long been used to communicate with hundreds, if not thousands of people at once. At the same time, WhatsApp and Signal are used throughout the world by journalists and activists to securely communicate in repressive contexts or about sensitive investigations. And you may have previously heard of these platforms when law enforcement officials raised concerns over terrorists using private messaging to coordinate their operations. The report we just launched, which is written by our resident fellow, Iria Priosa, is a major contribution in better understanding this space. It maps the landscape of messaging apps in the United States and reviews the features of 40 such apps, including approaches to identity, registration, encryption, and much more. It then uses case studies of specific communities on Telegram, WeChat, and WhatsApp to examine the impact and implications of various design, policy, and enforcement approaches. Today's conversation will focus on the question of how platforms and apps approach detection of content or behavior that violates their policies and the implications for privacy in the information space more broadly. While we hope that this event will be an accessible entry point for many on this topic, I encourage you to check out the full report online, which includes a number of recommendations for platforms, governments, and users more broadly to bolster encryption while ensuring safety and the safeguarding of basic rights and privacy. You can find a link to that report in the chat in Zoom or by navigating to our website, DFRLab.org. As always, we welcome your thoughts and engagement on this topic on the ever-expanding list of social media platforms where you can find us, including Twitter or X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and T2 using our handle @DFRLab. If you're following along today and in need of closed captioning, please head over to our YouTube channel through the link provided in the chat. It's now my pleasure to turn this over to our moderator, Justin Hendricks, the CEO and editor of Tech Policy Press, who recently released a fascinating report himself on messaging apps and security, which I encourage you to check out as well. Thank you to all of you for tuning in today, to our panelists for joining us on our virtual stage, and the community of researchers and experts that are digging into this issue alongside of us every day. Justin, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you for having me be part of this event. Very much looking forward to it. Thanks to Atlantic Council and DFRLab. And we've got a great panel today, folks who have done a range of different projects looking at encrypted messaging from different angles and perspectives, looking at through the lens of their own disciplines and thinking about these applications. We've got Ira Pijosa, who you already heard, Senior Research Fellow at DFRLab, of course, Robert Fabricant, co-founder and partner at Dahlberg Design, which is a very fascinating firm that I'm sure he'll tell us a bit about. Connie Moon Sahat, a researcher at large at Hacks and Hackers, and finally, Rihanna Pfefferkorn, a research scholar at the Stanford Internet Observatory. So we're going to have a round of questions back and forth, talk about a range of issues in this place. But Iria, I want to start with you because to some extent, you're the reason for this event, your work and this excellent project you've done on protecting point-to-point messaging apps, understanding Telegram, WeChat, and WhatsApp in the United States. Maybe I'll just give you somewhat of a softball, let you hold forth on what you found about in this report on some level, and just ask you, if you were explaining this to someone on the street, why did you do this report? And what were some of the key findings, some of the things that stand out to you that if you had to explain it to a stranger, what would you first want them to take away?
Thank you, Justin. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. Well, this research we did in messaging apps try to first understand how people are using these messaging apps here in the United States, the world. But in the United States, it's kind of been considered kind of fringe. One of the first findings they are not. A lot of people, the majority of people in the United States is using some of them for different reasons, for different needs, for different types of communications. That was one of our first interests, to understand how these apps are used, who are using them, for what purpose, in what ways, and also understand how the way people want to use the apps interact with the architecture of the app, how the app is built, designed technically, and how the interface works, how the features available to the users are, and also how that interact with the policies any apps are enforcing it. So this is kind of a triangle in which users are the drivers, but they drive in a road is built by the platforms with some technical features, but there is some regulations in the way you can drive in those roads. It's the platform policies, and in some places, increasingly so, some legal regulations mandated by the states in which this platform operates. So we want to understand how this triangle works, what is possible, what is needed, what is wanted, and what is kind of harmful behaviors are dealt with by platforms. We decided to look to we first map the environment, what the apps are available here in the United States, what people are using, and we decided to focus in three messages who are very different in regard to their policies and somewhat different in the ways people use them. These are WeChat, Telegram, and WhatsApp. WhatsApp being the most commonly used, but WeChat and Telegram also had a growing user base here in the United States. And these have very different policies, with WeChat being more restricted in terms of the content they allow, the behavior they allow, Telegram being more or less fair in permitting different kind of content is usually not allowed with the most social media platforms, and WhatsApp being kind of in the middle, in which people had some choices but some restrictions too. So we kind of compare these differences in the way this ad works.
So I know, major focus, of course, was diaspora communities and the sort of distinctions between different diaspora communities and how they use these applications. Could you maybe just give a little more specifics on what you see as perhaps some of the commonalities, some of the positives of what you see going on with messaging apps in diaspora communities, and what are some of the negatives or the harms that you discovered?
Yes, and at the beginning, at the background with this project, it was a couple of years ago, it was a lot of conversation in public space in the United States about misinformation regarding COVID or regarding political issues going completely out of control in messaging apps, particularly targeting diaspora communities, Latinos and Asians. And that was part of the things we wanted to understand, to see whether that was actually happening. There is some misinformation there, like everywhere in the society, even mass media, radio stations. We had a lot of misinformation too, but it was not the predominant kind of content we found in those apps. We were monitoring Latino groups in WhatsApp, and Asian, Chinese, American groups in WeChat, and we find most of the communications going on in those channels and those groups had to do with community building, exchanging resources, exchanging information, often using valid official sources of information to make decisions and to try to overcome the barriers, the linguistic barriers, the people from English speaking had to access information. So it was usually beneficial use to help people from non-English background to be active citizens in the United States. There was some misinformation, there was some political motivated misinformation, health-related misinformation, particularly related with weight loss. It was a very common issue in those groups. I think COVID was already passed when we were doing the research, so it was a kind of different health misinformation we were finding. But most of the contents, as I say, had to do with mutual support, exchanging resources, helping each other to find differences like housing, employment. That kind of is the focus of the conversation we saw in diaspora groups. It's kind of very different that the picture is in mass media about this being a complete mess of total lies and disinformation. It's something is there, but it's not prevalent, it's not dominant.
So we're lucky on this call, we've got multiple people who have looked into encrypted messaging apps in different ways. They've applied different methods. In the case of the research report that I contributed to, along with Cooper Quinton and Carolyn Sinders, Tim Bernard, Ami Mehta, Layla Wagner, that Rose mentioned earlier, we combined sort of a security review with a bit of qualitative kind of free-form journalistic discussions with folks using encrypted message apps. I want to ask you, Connie, as someone who's done some work on the ethics of doing research on encrypted message apps, given the state of the field, do you sort of think we have enough insight into what's happening across these applications? Encrypted means, we don't know what happens from one point to the next. And so it's a little bit difficult to kind of peer inside and really get a full sense of what's happening across these applications. What's your view on the state of the field?
Thank you, Justin. That's such a great question. I think, I've been kind of like going back and forth to try and figure out how to answer this question. In some ways, I think, yes, we do have enough insight, and that's like a yes and a no sort of answer basically there. And the point I would like to make is that I think we know quite a lot about what's happening in encrypted message spaces without needing an encryption, right? I mean, studies like the one that IRIA just conducted show, we know that there's a lot of horrible stuff happening in closed messaging spaces, but there's also a lot of empowering and super interesting ways that communities are finding to connect. We also know, of course, like the long history of, for example, journalists and other human rights observers who use these encrypted spaces to speak to one another in context in which they could not do that securely otherwise. So in some ways, I actually think we have quite sort of rich bits, sort of insight into different ways that people are creatively using WhatsApp. Also, for example, governments as well, or, in terms of different closed messaging spaces where they're trying to take advantage of the platform to be connected with their publics. But the thing that I think that we're not quite yet there in terms of insight, at least I can at least speak for myself, is the larger meaning of what these closed messaging apps do for our overall public conversation. Like, what does it mean that, for example, Telegram has a public function as well as a private function, even though it's encrypted? And I think that one of the things that encrypted messaging apps do, right, is that they've kind of hybridized certain things, right? Like this notion that there's some kind of privacy entailed if it's just you and me having a one-on-one in encryption versus an encrypted chat with over 500 other people, in which I think any expectation of privacy is like reasonably, like maybe not reasonable, right? And so the thing that I am longing to sort of, dig into more, and I think why we continue to need research in this area, is more to kind of understand what is the shape of these, what are the shape of these messaging apps doing for our public conversation, especially for a democratic context. I think that needs continue like understanding and research and something that I'm still longing to know for myself.
I think I'll come next to you then, Robert. You've looked into these apps from a design perspective, thinking about how to design for what you call trustworthiness. You talk to folks in Colombia, Nigeria, also here in the US, about these encrypted apps. And, found, I think, a variety of different things that perhaps connect to some of the things that Connie was saying about ways in which users may misunderstand how these apps function, or may have, in some cases, mental models about how the apps function that are different from how they actually function in practice.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up a bit, Justin. And let me say first a bit about the research we did. It was all qualitative. It's not, the research we do as a human-centered design firm is not app-centric, it's people-centric. So I just want to start there. It's not starting with the footprint of what an app does and doesn't do. It's starting with a footprint of people's lives and where they fit. And these apps and services fit in their lives. And Connie's right, that's changing, it's hybridizing. And we've known for a long time that a lot of the signals for where those changes are happening need to be seen across cultures and across countries, and not just through a US lens or through the lens of a particular app. And, from our perspective, there are no misunderstandings. The misunderstandings have to do with people and how they're trying to adapt. Security doesn't live inside an app. Security lives in your mind. And if you don't feel secure, encryption doesn't change that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, to your point about mental models, is a lot of people have built their notion of where these apps initially fit in their lives off of text messaging, off of very simple. And they've seen text messaging I'm going to use a funny word, get polluted, if not corrupted, because it now is a source of marketing. And so any confidence they bring to other peer-to-peer apps is already going to be sitting on that sort of fragile foundation. A sense that these are not spaces that they can feel comfortable, that that they know how to manage risk on them, and that their information is safeguarded. And I don't think there's a way to reel that back. I don't think the new, the advertising campaigns about encryption, I don't think the new controls and people's settings are going to change that. I think we've stepped through that door. And I think another door Connie brought up we've stepped through is that they are becoming, in many places, major news sources, and particularly places where the political situation might be a bit different. And people are trying to learn through different environments, whether that's places like Nigeria or Colombia. So things have changed a lot. And I think that mental model has frayed quite a bit. And so people are left when they feel vulnerable. And I will say the research we did was with a broad cross-section of people. We weren't targeting particularly at-risk people, yet again and again, we found out everybody feels vulnerable. Whether it's a Nigerian tailor, a woman who creates clothes and sells them online, WhatsApp has become her business. She's worried that her designs are getting forged. She feels very vulnerable in not knowing and being able to control the groups in which they're being shared. We can sort of talk about somebody who's leading a self-help group for teens in Colombia and feeling again that there's a lot of risk for these teens, not just because of issues with the app, but because phones are not private. There are many other ways to get at this information. So everyone's feeling vulnerable. And when they feel vulnerable, the tools provided to them don't meet them kind of where they are in terms of what their mental model is. The idea that if you're feeling vulnerable, the idea that reporting something is going to make you feel safer is actually not the way people think and behave. Reporting something makes you feel at greater risk. The idea of leaving a group, leaving an app as a way of exerting control and creating a greater sense of security is also actually not the way people perceive their relationship in the world. It's very visible. It's a very visible step to take. So we're not operating under misunderstandings about people. I mean, people aren't operating under misunderstandings about the way these things work. We're operating a bit on misunderstandings about people and the changing nature that these apps play in their lives. And coming back to Connie's point, we don't have a great way of learning and documenting those changes because these are very private conversations. And so that's why the research that we got to do for us, it felt like such a great opportunity to look across many markets, talk to a very diverse cross-section of people, and be able to try and pull from them and their understanding of their own situation some patterns, which we released in a report and a website that we love for people to check out after this call, and see if it can inform policymakers, app makers, many folks.
So you bring up reporting, for instance, as one method that folks are using to kind of try to keep themselves safe in these environments. Of course, leaving groups, et cetera, the different types of options that are there. I think that brings up something that IREA's report does focus on, methods for detecting harmful content and messaging apps. We've got a range of things you discuss, from user reporting, message franking, metadata analysis, the possibility of backdoors, escrow systems, automated scanning, hash databases, implications of various content detection methods. And I think it's safe to say that all the researchers on this particular program or call that you're hearing from today came out essentially with a strong support for encryption generally, and for the notion of encryption. And yet there are all of these various mechanisms that are being employed in different ways across the suite of encrypted message apps that are out there in the world. And Rihanna, I want to come to you because you've looked at these. You've talked to platform operators about how they implement these various moderation measures, which ones seem to be working from their perspectives. You've thought about the kind of policy implications of each. So I suppose I'll put that to you. Do you sort of see a gradient between these different options around how to moderate encrypted messaging apps in terms of which are more problematic from a privacy perspective, and which create the most value potentially for users and ultimately for people?
Thanks. Sorry. Thanks, Justin. Yeah. So I published some research last year in Stanford's Journal of Online Trust and Safety about the different content moderation techniques, sort of with a broad brush, that a group of online service providers that I surveyed undertake. And some of those were encrypted messaging services. Some of them were not. Some of them were more open platforms. And the buckets that I generally tried to group those in were either content dependent content moderation techniques, meaning that the only way for that method to work is that the app provider has to have at will access to the content of users' conversations, their files, in order to be able to apply that particular content moderation technique, such as doing automated scanning of the contents of a conversation. And on the other bucket, content oblivious detection techniques for content moderation, where you don't need to have at-will access to contents. And so that's things like analyzing metadata, analyzing behavioral signals. And from a privacy and security perspective, as somebody who's been working to advocate for strong encryption for a number of years at this point, obviously I'm on the side of things that preserve privacy, preserve the security properties that users expect when they choose to use a particular app, and that cannot necessarily be subverted to act against the user, either by the platform or by an outside entity such as a government. And so when we're talking about the things that can be the most privacy preserving, certainly in-app user reporting, where the user has the option to report content that makes them feel unsafe, that they consider to be abusive or illegal, was both something that I would consider to be the most trustworthy in terms of, can the app do something to me? Can the government do something to me? Although that doesn't necessarily get at Robert's point, which is once you say something to somebody else, you're kind of inherently trusting them. They could then screenshot it, they could share it elsewhere, they could report it onto the app, for example. But for preserving the privacy of the contents of the conversation, I found that to be both something that is respectful to the privacy and security of the user, and something that in my survey findings, a lot of the survey respondents themselves, these various companies, deemed to be the most effective and useful way for detecting many different types of abuse. Most of the types of abuse that I surveyed, the survey respondents said that in-app reporting was the best way to learn about that. For something like metadata analysis or analysis of behavioral signals, those don't allow access to the contents of users' conversations. And so to that degree, they can be useful, especially for detecting things like spam that can be very easily, or that we're very good now at detecting based on things like high volumes of messages being sent out, or contacting a large number of other users on the platform at a high rate of speed, for example. But that nevertheless can have some privacy trade-offs as well. The more metadata or behavioral signals that an app is collecting about you, that does reveal things about who you talk to, potentially where you are, if your geolocation data is being tracked and collected, or what patterns of interactions you may have on the app. So that can still be very revealing. And there are some apps that make the conscious choice to not collect a large amount of metadata or behavioral signals, specifically as a way of trying to be more respectful of user privacy. And then on the much more intrusive end, we've got things like having backdoors or what's called exceptional access for law enforcement to encrypted systems, which are proposals to create a way for law enforcement to be able to, at will, choose a particular conversation, a particular user account that they can get the plain text of, even if otherwise those conversations or those files might be encrypted, as well as at will proactive access to the contents of conversations and using automated content scanning, which is something that doesn't work in the context of end-to-end encrypted systems, because those are secure against outside snooping, even from the platform itself. The platform is essentially a dumb pipe that's passing those conversations between the two ends, between two users and their devices, or more than two potentially. And so in that context, that's something that obviously the respondents to my survey who are end-to-end encrypted messaging apps don't deploy. And that is considered to be useful for really only one category of content compared to in-app user reporting, and that's child safety offenses. But so overall, the findings sort of indicate that there isn't really a necessity to try and go along with some of the proposals that we have seen from governments around the world to try and programmatically deploy or require by law automated content scanning for a wide variety of different types of abusive content, because by and large it isn't even responsive to the sort of tools that actually work best, which is allowing users to have control over saying, this is abusive, I'm going to use my judgment and decide to report this out, as opposed to intruding upon the privacy of all users at all times.
Yuri, I want to bring you in because you also looked at these various methods, and this is the focus of your report as well. Don't want to give you quite the same question perhaps as I did to Rihanna, but perhaps allow you to maybe riff off what Rihanna was saying there. Anything you would add when it comes to this gradient of different types of interventions around content moderation, trust and safety mechanisms on encrypted messaging apps? What did you find in your report?
Yes, effectively, in the report, we devote some length to discuss the different methods and the platforms use to detect unacceptable content, unacceptable behavior according to their terms of uses. We actually do the kind of analysis of the different trade-off between the in-app user reported metadata analysis, analysis of the behavioral signals, automated content scanning, and keystroke systems. Actually, well, I agree a lot with what Rihanna said. In this more, we kind of go from in-app user reporting, like being content oblivious and more friendly to the user in terms of protecting their security and their privacy, metadata analysis and analysis of behavioral signals being sort of the middle, while automated content scanning and backdoor access of any way, particular keystroke systems are kind of untenable with encryption. They can be deployed in encrypted apps, and they certainly will break privacy of the users and will kind of make the apps more insecure, more unsafe for every kind of user. While in-app user reporting, even though it doesn't solve all the problems, and as Robert was saying, some users had kind of exited before reporting to a platform because they feel like somewhat they can be trapped in some legal argument. It is more respecting of the user's needs and wants. Meta-analysis and analysis of behavioral signals can be very effective for detecting some sort of behaviors who are infringing the terms of use of the platform or content which is harmful. But those kind of techniques, while respecting encryption, respecting the user security, had some issues regarding privacy. Some of the recommendations from our report to try to moderate the downsides of these two techniques is having strong data protection in the country. So that for us that's important. It's not just letting the platforms to decide how they handle these kind of issues, but having a general framework, a legal general framework for the country, what kind of data they can collect, how they can use the data. That would be helpful for everyone, and if we had users probably will have access to a better understanding of what kind of data the platforms are collecting for what is being used, and it will be overall positive for the whole environment of messenger apps and for other aspect of the social media experience too, actually.
Fundamental privacy protections and regulation, novel idea. Certainly wish maybe some folks would listen to you and all the others on these call who have suggested the same. Connie, maybe I'll ask you a question, just kind of keying in on the user responsibility or the responsibility of groups in particular to kind of set their own norms, do their own moderation. That's a lot of what we found was happening essentially inside of apps like WhatsApp and Signal, particularly amongst groups. You've looked at content moderation processes on Wikipedia and Reddit, I understand. Do you think community processes can be designed into managing groups and messaging apps, and that's a potentially fruitful direction to go to address some of these harms?
I mean, I definitely think it's a really fruitful direction to take. I mean, but of course, the challenge would be hard, right? The attraction of that is exactly as you say, right? That without the need necessarily to think about breaking encryption within these spaces themselves, can the users determine their own sort of goals and norms for how they want communication to happen and help create that sort of environment. And I think, again, like what my earlier comment about especially if it's a public conversation, that's the part that I would bring back into it, right? Like obviously openly makes it more as sort of like, how would I say, like important. So if you have an open encrypted channel where anyone can join, what are the kind of norms or what are the kinds of guidelines could they expect by coming into those spaces? So some ideas might be right. So, and it's unfortunate. I think some people here on this call may be familiar that Reddit is sunsetting its gold coins actually this year, right? Where it used to be sort of like one of my favorite things is how Reddit allows users to award each other points for their comments and their engagement and whatnot. Couldn't that be such an interesting positive way to kind of help communities, give them more tools to create the kind of conversation they want publicly, rather than just only sort of reporting negative issues, right? Of course, alongside that as well. But the balance of that, having like that working on a 256 like large group versus though having a group of 5 people do we need, tools for 5 people to have that conversation with each other? Probably not. Seems a little bit cumbersome. So I think there's a really interesting design challenge there that is so rich for possibility about trying to think about what are the positive encrypted message spaces that we might want, but also thinking about how, when they're public, I guess that's part of the thing that keeps on coming back to me anyway.
Robert, that feels like it flows to you and your experience with looking at the different types of possibilities to improve functionality for different functions on encrypted apps, including in-app user reporting. Are there other kinds of design interventions that you developed in the process of your study that you think could have bearing on some of the things Connie's just mentioned, or Yuria or Biana?
Yeah, a lot of things are connected, and I do want to say our work might be a little different in that we took the step of prototyping and testing some ideas and ways of improving these dynamics. To take a quick step back, I am skeptical of the role of user reporting in significantly changing these dynamics, particularly around the misinformation and disinformation. We did not see a lot of examples of that behavior and a lot of incentives that people talked about to step out and be the one to take an action in those situations other than potentially leaving a group. Much more likely to do it if they've been personally scammed, if they feel more personally that they have been identified and to some degree targeted in some way, particularly some sort of business scam. That's where we probably heard a bit more about it. The one thing I'll say, and then the second thing I'll be a little skeptical about is I don't think the barrier to people reporting more is more ironclad privacy protections that are built into the fundamental apps. I think the barrier is, again, a sense of vulnerability. And that means in order to strengthen reporting, I think certain preconditions need to be met, which is easier for me to manage my visibility, particularly in large group forums, my visibility in terms of my image, my phone number, many pieces of information about me. Easier way when I enter and leave those groups to understand who's there, who's not there, what's changed. Like there's a lot of context I need to feel less vulnerable before I'm going to take that reporting step. And then there are post conditions, which is redressal, feedback, what happened, what didn't. All these things, without them, the apps are going to continue to roll out certain kinds of reporting features, not see, I think, dramatic changes in the use of them, and probably go to sleep pretty well at night, other than in extreme situations. So I do think that a lot of these things are connected, and what people are looking for are ways in situations and in moments. And we looked literally at the moment you're invited to a group, what other information could be provided. At the moment when you're updating your badge picture, what different ways could you think about who that's available to and not? These are the things that I think, because they're being introduced at the moment when you're engaging with the app, not at the moment you feel at greatest risk. And that's the problem with reporting. Reporting is some of you trying to get someone to do it at the moment of vulnerability. These are coming up at other points. They increase confidence. They increase a sense of generalized situational control. And without that, what we see is people set up their own policies and practices when they feel vulnerable. They'll suddenly say, I'm not joining a group if it has more than 40 members. That could be a good choice for them, a bad choice for them, but it's a policy they're setting. It's not an option in the settings of the app. So to me, there are lots of things that the apps can do. And my worry is that too much focus on things like reporting mechanisms or privacy settings are distracting from other things that will increase friction, will slow adoption, will add more barriers to signing in, signing up, joining groups, all the things that are the treadmill. I mean, the flywheel of their business. But those are the areas where I think users are really looking for help. And as a byproduct, if you can address those things, I think you'll see people feeling more empowered to stand up and do some of these community management and reporting things. But if you don't, then I think, these other things are going to probably fall a bit short of what we'd all hope.
And I know from talking to some of the platform operators that, they're always kind of doing this calculus between, introducing new features, new safety mechanisms, managing safety and trustworthiness on the one hand, and potentially discouraging people from using the applications because they may be taking away some features that are attractive to folks. But Iri, I want to allow you to respond perhaps to Robert and anything that you might like to add.
Yes, those kind of friction mechanisms that Robert was referring to would be very useful in the case of the public groups. And we are now seeing public channels, communities, large groups in which the way of entering in the conversation, it should be kind of some steps of people knowing what kind of space they are entered to. But I wanted to point out that it was kind of not totally expected, but not totally surprised when we were doing the monitoring in the Latino groups, the Latino diaspora groups, migrants in the United States. We did found people actively, proactively fact-checking the content it was shared in the groups. People were trying to, when somebody posted some piece, some content from low credibility sources, we often found somebody else replying and saying, this is wrong, look at this, this is an official source, look at this. So people were kind of crowdsourcing credible information in those spaces. And I guess it's because those spaces were very valuable for those people that they wanted to protect. And that goes with how important is the space for you, how you feel connected to that space make a difference. We didn't find that kind of behavior in Telegram groups. It was more group thinking and everyone agreeing, and the more polemic, more controversial the content was, more people were agreeing to. There's completely different the behavior I was seeing in the Latino groups, in which people were trying to protect the space for gathering useful information for them to make decisions about immigration status, housing, employment. So they didn't want this space to be contaminated. So they were very active in keeping the space safe. And for instance, they were also trying to keep these spaces out of politics when it was controversial about politics here in the United States or back in the home countries where the foreign immigrants came from. They tried, please don't post that kind of content here. Please keep the conversation on the issues belong to all. Also, don't post anything divisive and nothing polarizing. So that kind of dynamics are kind of self-regulation, and maybe platforms can introduce some design tweaks that help people to make those more formalized. That kind of decision they want to do.
Brianna, maybe I'll ask you to kind of take that in the direction you might like to go in with it, but to some extent, is there a sort of trade-off we're seeing here essentially between what we expect the users to do, what we expect the app to do, who's responsible essentially for maintaining a kind of safe, trustworthy private environment inside of these, particularly inside of groups?
It's a great question, and one that I think brings up a lot of important issues around where does our labor go? Like, is community self-moderation, purely an act of love or of community, mindedness, or is it a bunch of unpaid labor that may often be in the service of a company like Meta, for example, that sits on billions and billions of dollars, and that nevertheless, in addition to having people be self-managing to do misinformation correction within WhatsApp groups, for example, that they do also have a lot of moderators, often outsourced overseas, often underpaid, often without adequate mental health resources to deal with the kinds of material that does get reported out or that gets detected automatically in unencrypted spaces. And I think this is one of the more complicated questions, both inside of encrypted messaging spaces and in more open platforms, is just reckoning with the communities that we've built, where a large degree of internal sort of user judgment and norm setting and discretion is appropriate, I think, in a lot of situations, rather than expecting everything to be policed externally. And at the same time, at least trying to acknowledge some of the directionality of where that labor is coming from. I think this is particularly cogent, though, in the context of encrypted spaces, because you can't necessarily see out from that. If you have user reporting, you're sort of relying on that, to go back to Robert's point in response to my earlier comment, that it may not necessarily be seen as effective. Maybe the platforms, to go back to my own research, see it as effective to have user reporting, but users might not necessarily see it to be such. And the question also of, when do users want to make this a matter for the platforms themselves? One of the great boons, I think, of having so many different messaging apps on the market, both end-to-end encrypted or partially so or not, is that people can choose which one works best for them, and that for some people, they may want an extremely light touch app where it's kind of every person for themselves, and some people may want a more heavily externally managed experience. But nevertheless, the sort of core question of self-management versus delegating to some sort of outside authority, whether that's within the app or outside the app, such as government, comes down to the question that I think is always kind of underlying fundamental issues around content moderation and regulation, especially of these apps, which is, do we want there to be spaces in human society that cannot be policed from the outside, that can only be policed internally by the people within it? And my answer to that question is yes. I think a lot of governments come down on the opposite side, but there are some consequences to coming down on the yes side of that question, which is it does then flow from there that we are taking up the mantle of responsibility for managing our own experiences on this app. And that is, I think, sort of an unspoken or underexplored bargain that users are making in the vastly, wild runaway popularity of apps that have billions of users around the world.
I want to kind of pose a question, maybe slightly based on the research report that I mentioned earlier that we conducted with Tech Policy Press and Convocation earlier, which is about the way that these messaging apps interact with the broader information ecosystem. Of course, we're living in, arguably, under a kind of surveillance capitalism sort of frame when it comes to the social media, the information environment that we're in. Many of the companies that provide these messaging apps also operate social media platforms or trying to cram social media features perhaps into the messaging apps themselves. I might just throw the floor open to anyone who might have a sort of thought about how that broader environment and the incentives and motivations perhaps of the information ecosystem sort of affect the way we behave in messaging apps, the way content flows across them. And maybe Iri, I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, I will start like describing what we found. It's a complete interaction, even between open social media and with the kind of interaction we observed on messaging apps. People are always sharing content is coming from social media in those spaces. So it's a private conversation, but a close group, but people are bringing in YouTube videos, TikTok videos, links to websites. So that is part of the flow. It's part of the conversation. So it's not an isolated space in which only people talking to people. It's people talking about issues who are in the larger social media space. And also it's possible, we observed more on that with Telegram, that people take conversations from closed social messaging apps and post it in more open spaces. And that kind of is, for some people, it's like the continuous information we live in. It's nothing wrong about taking a screenshot from something had in a closet conversation and sharing with everyone in Twitter, Facebook, or something else. And that poses other kind of issues about privacy, security, issues of doxing. We haven't touched it yet, but it still is a problematic issue we are observing in that complete interaction of things. And it actually had implications related with what regulations trying to access content in messaging apps had to deal with. So some of the conversation is kind of made of things. There are bad things happening in messaging apps who are not occurring in other places, and it's actually not true. So it's coming from most of the dangerous content, the harmful content is coming from open social media and resharing in those groups. So that idea that this is some separated space is not actually completely true. It's a social semi-private space. We had intersections with more open space. We need to be kind of aware of that complications, that diffuse lines between each other in order to understand how people use them, how platforms interact with other products they had in their portfolio, particularly important when we're talking about behavioral signals and metadata analysis, and actually how states can regulate those space. So we can look at this as something isolated and separated. It happens as a continuum of information.
I want to kind of come back to the question around regulation. Of course, we are in an environment where various policies are proposed in the UK and the EU, in the US, changes happening in India and other places abroad that impact the function of encrypted apps. So we'll come back to policies. But before we do that, maybe just to kind of keep on this theme just a little bit, Connie, you have worked on different ways over the years to think about news credibility. Are there ways perhaps that you imagine we could incorporate signals of news credibility into encrypted message apps?
Yes, I mean, and it's actually been a topic that I think a number of other researchers have also tried to brainstorm. Like, for example, I mean, maybe like, let's take it back a step. One of the more interesting research methodologies that the earlier ethics report sort of was able to clarify is that some researchers will go into closed messaging spaces and try to understand the space, not through not through any message content, but only through the links that are shared, if they end up being public, sort of URLs, et cetera. Or for, to come back to Irio's point, going to some like external, like application space like YouTube, which we also find vice versa, right? So we find that all of those YouTube and Facebook platforms are also sometimes pointing to, in certain groups, those closed messaging spaces in order to have what they feel are more private conversations, as opposed to some that are remaining on one platform. So I do think that flow, that's definitely something that was apparent in the Brazilian elections of recent years, has been very interesting. So this idea, right, that could there be a way in which you have, say, links of articles that you are sharing, and then design-wise, there's some kind of indicator as to the quality of that information? Potentially, yes. I've seen some interesting designs around that, but I think the question will still come back to, well, number one, the ways that people might interpret that. What's our desire around understanding the information that's being shared within any particular group context? What do we want users to take away from that? And I think that that's a little different. Again, I'm going to kind of come back to the size like question as the easiest way to potentially understand that. Its function in a 500 large group is going to be one thing. Its function in a 10 person large group is a different one. And maybe as a kind of follow on to that, to kind of tag on to Rihanna's point, which I think her questions and answers were so, just so valuable. This thing about, self-management versus what the platforms are responsible for. Could that also be part of the equation? Are we, if you sort of unleash a 500 person room, what is your responsibility over allowing for that kind of creative capacity, as opposed to a group of 5 gathering together? I'm sort of wondering whether or not, there is this way, right, in terms of the hybridization of these apps, where there's a lot of creative flow that's possible, but potentially could, size be one of these factors in which, we just need to demand more, basically, in terms of what a public responsibility is for platforms as they allow for that capacity.
We only have a few moments left, and I want to perhaps, as is my want, running a thing called Tech Policy Press, want to kind of come to the policy implications of some of the work that folks on the call have done. Iria, you have a variety of different kind of policy recommendations at the conclusion of your report. Are there a few that you'd want to call out and make sure that you kind of get across?
Yes, sure. I already anticipated. I believe one of the major recommendations coming out of this report, our understanding of the environment, information environment we are living in, and the data-driven industry is really we need to develop as a society good, strong, robust, right protecting data protection regulations. So that's that for us. That this is kind of the major issue, and is not only about trying to moderate harmful content. It's about protecting users' autonomy when using information applications, using data-driven applications. Not only messaging apps, social media is health apps. So it's a growing experience as a human beings in society, in which we are all the time giving away data about our behavior, ourselves, and this data is being processed here in the United States, particularly more than in other countries in the world. Is a huge challenge. It's something we need to address as a society, how to protect people's data. And for us, it's kind of central to this project, specific to data in messaging apps, but actually related with the more broader environment. For me, this is the major policy recommendation coming out from this report. Of course, we had other recommendations related with how platforms can be more transparent, how they can partner with organizations doing research to better understand the environments and have a more effective policies. We're looking at very different things, but see, I had to pick out one. I will pick up data protection legislation.
Excellent. And Rihanna, maybe I'll slightly put you on the spot. You know, you've commented on the policy environment around encryption through a particular lens. You've talked about concerns about one particular community, those, you know, seeking reproductive health care, even seeking abortion in the United States, in kind of a post-Roe environment. You know, how would you kind of take this question about policy recommendations, perhaps through that lens?
You know, that's a great question. We have seen some measures that some individual states have been taking in the wake of the Dobbs decision a year ago to try and protect data that is held by tech companies within those states from being disclosed to authorities in states that have now criminalized abortion. It's such a stark reminder to pull back a little bit that something can be a constitutional right one day and a crime the next day, overnight. And so, to go to Iria's point, having strong data protection laws as the norm, having encryption as the norm wherever we can, and having legal protections for the right to offer the strongest possible security and privacy protections to your users is of the utmost importance, because you never know if data that has been collected that is accessible to law enforcement may go from something that they may have no interest in to something that they want to investigate as a crime after some unduly long retention period of data that maybe didn't need to be kept that long or kept in the first place. So we're seeing this kind of scattershot approach a little bit to try to make up for policy changes that degraded the right to privacy in the United States, and that I think remains to be seen how well that plays out in terms of being a policy response that only kind of works insofar as we have only a couple of states on the West Coast that are the headquarters for most of the big tech companies, or most of the companies that offer encrypted messaging and other apps that provide that kind of communications ability. That's kind of a happenstance of history. It shouldn't really come down to where companies happen to be located for users to know whether those users are located within that jurisdiction or outside of it, whether their data is going to be safe or not. And so, I would like to see stronger norms that countries around the world can agree upon, because this is just a state-by-state issue. We've also had a lot of struggles within the last few years over cross-border access to data, and trying to establish strong norms like we have seen within cross-border data access with regard to respect for civil liberties, respect for privacy, and non-compliance with data requests that fall below that standard. Nevertheless, I think we live in a climate where we see so many, even Western democracies, being increasingly hostile to personal privacy and more in favor of greater surveillance, that I don't necessarily know whether it's realistic to hope that we can get to sort of a global norm for that. And it's especially unfortunate to the degree that having Western democracies working to undermine privacy and civil liberties does nothing but set an example for repressive governments elsewhere to do the same thing.
We're just about out of time. We've got about a minute left. So I'll just, Robert, Connie, 30 seconds each. Any final thoughts could be on policy or directions for future work.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is that I don't feel that, at least that users we spoke to are operating in an environment in which they can shop from one venue to another to find their comfort zone. WhatsApp is still setting the dominant field for everybody to participate in. And so that's why I think policies are so important. I think there might be a future where people start to focus on, this is the environment I'm most comfortable with for smaller community-based engagement, and this is the environment where I'll participate in larger news-based engagement. So there could be a future like that, but I don't think it's the world that we exist in today. And so I think we didn't see any, even the most privacy aware and technically savvy folks being able to stay off WhatsApp for any significant period of time, or even to constrain easily what would happen there because it involved other people. So that's why, to me, these policies are super important, even as people's behavior starts to evolve and mature, as more options are available and more different ways of adapting and using messaging platforms emerge.
Connie, last word, 15 seconds. We'll let it be at that point then. Iria Pujosa, congratulations on this report. Protecting point-to-point messaging apps, understanding Telegram, WeChat, and WhatsApp in the United States from Atlantic Council, DFRLab. Hope folks will check that out. And thank you to our panelists today, to Robert, to Connie, to Rihanna. Thank you so much for joining, and very grateful to you all, and look forward to continuing this conversation.